Welcome to Change by Attraction, because you don't have to push, prod, persuade, or punish people to create change in your organization. I'm your host, Esther Derby. Today I'm going to talk to you about forests. Now, it might not seem that this has a lot to do with organizational change, but I think there's actually a lot for us to learn about change in how forests come into being. Here's the thing. You can't just take a bunch of trees and a bunch of wildflowers and plant them in any old piece of ground and end up with a forest. It doesn't work that way. Forests emerge when the conditions are right for a forest. Forests don't just pop up. Forests come about through a natural process called succession. Suppose you're starting from a rocky piece of ground. The first plants that take hold there might be scrubby little weeds. But those scrubby little weeds change the soil a little bit. They might loosen it up. They might add some nutrients. They might remove some nutrients. They hold a little moisture. And those changes make it possible for another plant community to come in. Maybe slightly taller plants, maybe some grasses, some weeds. And they might hold more moisture in the ground, which changes the humidity a little bit, which allows yet another plant community to come in, maybe some woody shrubs. Those create a little bit of shade, which again changes the humidity, loosens the ground, creates the opportunity for another plant community to emerge. And it goes on like this until you have the conditions where the trees we think of as a forest, either pines or oaks or maples, have the conditions where they can really thrive. And as the bigger plants come in, the taller trees come in and create a canopy, shades the understory, certain other species die out, which creates the opportunity for yet another species of plants to come in. There's usually not a clear delineation between these stages, but if you look closely, you can see the process starting. We have seen forests in our area where plant species are starting to arrive that didn't exist in northern Minnesota 30 years ago, but the conditions are becoming ripe for them. Of course, this will mean that other species that thrived in our climate, the climate isn't going to be good for them anymore. So you can start to see that change early, and it may only be a few trees here and there, but over time, there will be many more trees that will supplant the ones that thrived here. But you have to be really observant, right? You have to be really observant to see that change while it's still in its early process. So if you're only looking every, 5 or 10 years, the change might seem really sudden. But if you are paying attention to the very small changes, you can see it unfold over time. In nature, this process can take decades. There are some ecologists who have figured out how to speed up the process by paying careful attention to the soil composition and finding a plant community that will thrive the way things are and create the next possibility. So each plant community changes and adapts the environment, which then creates an environment for another plant community. So how does this relate to organizational change? I think a lot of companies try planting a fully mature forest on ground that just isn't going to support it. It's like people talking about installing change. They have an idea that it is a stepwise process, that you put in a change and suddenly everything is different and everything works in a different way. But in reality, you always start where you are in an organization. You have the existing environment, the policies, the procedures, the practices. You have the way people think about things. You have the skills you have. And that's really where you have to start from. You have to look for something that will work with what you have now and create a small adaptation in the environment that allows something else to take hold. Each small change, a new skill, a new way of looking at problems or framing problems, creating more ability for people to bring up issues, all of those small things will create an alteration in the environment. And you just keep working, creating alteration after alteration, allowing new things to take hold. Now, most organizations aren't counting on a natural process of succession. They actually want to move in a particular direction. So when I work with organizations, I approach this in two ways. We start by thinking backwards. Now, this may seem like the idea of start with the end in mind, but it's really an exercise in looking at where you want to go and thinking critically about what would have to be true, what would have to exist in order for that desired state to be present in your organization. And then you think, what would have to be present for that to exist? And you keep working backwards until you get to the now, which is where everything starts, right? You have to deal with where you are now. You find some place where you can actually take a tangible action that will move you in the direction you want to go. What this does is it helps people understand the complexity of changing the environment, and it helps people really attend to what they need to do to create a situation where the change is likely to take hold and likely to thrive. It really focuses on a much more granular level of the change that actually needs to take place. What new skills do people need to learn? What infrastructure needs to be in place? How does leadership need to change? How do we make decisions now, and what would be conducive to what we say we want to accomplish? So it really brings people to a very grounded notion of what's involved in the change. It's maybe not quite as comforting as saying, well, we just have to have our process and train everybody and roll it out. But it is much more grounded in where you are, because change always starts with where you are. So once we've done the exercise of thinking backwards, then we can think forwards. I do this with a method I call landing zones, which I adapted from Rebecca Werfsbrock's architectural landing zones. So these are a way to help people find landing spots. That's why they're landing zones. So you have this big vision of where you want to go, and you know where you are, and sometimes that can feel super overwhelming. So it's useful to have an intermediate goal, some state that you can work towards that will give you a sense that you have accomplished something, that you're making progress, that you're validating your ideas, and that the actions that you thought would move you in the direction you want to go are actually moving you there and not in some other direction. So say you have a bunch of critical customer incidents that are costing penalties, and leadership really wants you to get the critical incidents down to zero. That may seem like an unachievable goal given where you're starting from. It's a laudable goal, but it's not actually helpful in getting there. And this was actually the case at one of my clients. So I worked with them to describe what the current state was, and then to think about what would be worse, and what were some of the intermediate states that we could aim for. And we started with what would just be the next best thing. What would be a little bit better than what we had now? And in that case, it was having a clear idea of what the quality of the system was, so that they had a handle on whether they were open for incidents, and they had a way to assess risk, and they had a way to mitigate risk, to understand what was likely to cause problems and focus on that. So that was their next step. Let's just get a handle on where's the product at. And to do that, they shored up their testing. They worked on their build process. They had to learn some new skills, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was something they could actually make progress on. And once they achieved that, they could think about, is the step that we identified as the next step earlier still valid, or do we need to revisit that? Because they had a pause point. They had a point where they could take a breath, look at what was happening now, reassess the current situation, and figure out how to move to the next best step from where they were. These two methods for approaching a problem or an aspiration support people to focus on where you want to go, but also to really focus on creating the conditions so that when you do get there, it's sustainable. It's not like you've planted a bunch of trees on rocky ground and they look great for a couple of months and then they die. So they've really created an environment that will support the change that they want to see. They're preparing the way as they go, and they're learning as they go. Now, I know we aren't planting forests, or we're not helping forest succession in our work in organizations, but I think that concept is super powerful. We have to create a succession path so that with each alteration we make, we are planning for the next thing to emerge in our organization and be supported and thrive. Keep an eye on the goal, but also think about preparing the metaphorical ground, preparing the environment in your organization. Look at the factors that hold the current pattern in place. Maybe you have to do some work there first, kind of like ameliorating the soil if the soil wants support plant growth. Look for what can take hold in your current environment, because if you can get something small working, that will make a change, a minute change, a small change perhaps, but some change in the environment. And then you can figure out what that will support. Back chain from what your lofty goal is to where you are now. So you can figure out what are the skills we need, what are the ways of thinking we need to cultivate, what are the practices we need to put in place, what do people need to learn, what do they need to unlearn. Start with the smallest step. When you work this way, it's far more likely that you'll achieve a sustainable change. If you want to learn more about how to do change this way, check out my book, 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change, Micro Shifts, Macro Results. There's a whole chapter on assessing what is and figuring out the smallest places you can start. Thanks for listening. You'll find references and links mentioned in the episode at changebyattraction.simplecast.com. Check out my website and blog at www.estherderby.com. You'll find lots of articles about change, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. If you enjoyed the podcast, please let your friends know and rate it on Simplecast or wherever you get your podcasts.